Recent reporting from the Intercept definitively tied NIH dollars to bat coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The article sent waves through D.C. and led major Republicans like Rand Paul and Jim Jordan to call for Dr. Anthony Fauci's resignation and even his potential prosecution. Now, new reporting reveals that while there is evidence the U.S. funded gain-of-function research and that the experiment posed biosafety risks, it did not necessarily cause the coronavirus pandemic. Mara Hvistendahl and Sharon Lerner, investigative reporters at The Intercept, and the journalists behind the bombshell story, join us now to discuss. So, Mara, what can you tell us broadly about what you uncovered in these 900 pages?
Sure. Well, so these are documents that Sharon FOIA'd nearly a year ago. And from a few months after the start of the pandemic, there were a lot of questions being asked about a particular grant funded by NIH involving collaboration between researchers at the EcoHealth Alliance, which is a U.S. nonprofit, and researchers at Wuhan, including at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And there was a lot of speculation about what might have happened, and speculation that maybe so-called gain-of-function research, which involves making viruses more transmissible and more pathogenic, had happened there. And so we wanted to figure out what's actually in the grant. And we finally got those documents back last week.
And Sharon, how does what was actually in the grant compare with what Dr. Fauci has actually said in public and even in congressional testimony?
Sure. So the real issue here, the point of contention, are these gain of function research that Mara mentioned. And what we found was that there was one particular experiment that did fit the definition of gain of function research according to most of the scientists we interviewed. And so again, that's the kind of research that modifies a biological agent, makes it, gives it new properties, basically. And the particular experiment that we looked at, and the one that seemed most important in these 900 pages, is an experiment that takes, it started with one virus that is a bat coronavirus. And basically, there were there are sort of hybrid versions of this virus made that are referred to as chimeric viruses. And previously, these chimeric viruses, in research that wasn't published there, had weren't particularly, didn't have enhanced function when they were put in a lab petri dish with cells. But what these researchers did in this US-funded experiment was they took these chimeric viruses and they injected them into genetically engineered mice, so into their actual bodies, not just the cells. And they compared how those viruses behaved compared to the original virus, which they call the parent virus. And what they saw was at certain points after they infected them, that they replicated way more quickly than the originals. And also that they, in some cases, seemed to make the mice sicker, which is what they call pathogenicity or evidence of pathogenicity. And when we talk to people who are in this field and work closely on this kind of science, they, for the most part, with very few exceptions that we noted, agreed that this fit the definition of gain of function. And I should say that we very specifically looked at NIH's own definition. And so this is really the issue at hand scientifically.
So what does the NIH say? Like, Sharon, how does the NIH respond and say, well, no, in fact, we were still being honest because if you gloss it in this particular way, what we said somehow comports with reality. How do they get around this apparent contradiction?
Two things. They do two things. First, they said, the question was on so many people's minds, did you know this was happening? And what they said was, yes, we reviewed this. And they never quite said, and decided it wasn't gain of function research. Instead, what they said was, we decided that it should not be subject to the restrictions that we put on gain of function research. And specifically, they're talking about two things. One is this pause that happened on such research between 2014 and 2017. And after that, it's these guidelines that were applied to that kind of research. So they said that. But then specifically about the science, what they said was, they kind of dug into, I mentioned that, there is this increased production of the virus. It reproduces more quickly. And that's particularly on days 2 and 4 of this experiment they did. But when they got to the end of the experiment, which was, it looks like day 8, but it's when they basically killed the mice, we think it's day 8, it more or less had evened out. And so they said, well, that's not gain of function because look, at the end, it all kind of evened out. Many people we spoke to said, no, that is very much gain of function, and it matters what happens on day 2 and day 4, and systems ultimately even out.
Mm-hmm. Are you guys looking at all into the other funding sources to this EcoHealth Alliance and this research that they were conducting with Wuhan? I mean, obviously NIH is a big problem, right? And the tax dollars potentially going to that is a huge issue. But what about other funding sources as well? And their complicity in the whole thing.
Our request was focused primarily on NIH, and there is a lot of information in these documents. I mean, we are still going through them and still discovering things. I mean, they raise a lot of new questions about, experiments that have not been described in published papers. Why were they not described? There are some questions about missing data that have come up about, why certain passages were redacted, and so there's already quite a lot to work with. I mean, this is really the grant proposal that everybody wanted to get because the time frame of the grant work overlaps with the start of the pandemic, and so people are digging through it now as we speak, and we will continue to work on it. And then the other fact you asked about Fauci is that Fauci's testified that NIH and NIAID, the organization that he headed under NIH, categorically do not fund, has not funded gain of function research in China. Francis Collins, the head of NIH, has said, made similar statements. And the documents raise a lot of questions about whether that's true and how much Fauci and Collins knew about the work that was going on. And so, they do not definitively prove that Fauci lied, but they do raise a lot
questions
that going forward will need to be explored.
Yeah, my last question.
Sure with
oh, go ahead,
sorry,
Kim, go ahead.
Just that, with we don't want gain of function research to be happening. I think that's something that we're kind of realizing that was a thing. And so I think it's not only just the NIH that funding. The reason why I'm asking this is because we also don't want private citizens who are very wealthy, such as, let's say, the Bill Gates, Gates and the foundation, to be also funding this sort of research. So it's all, we might stop the tax dollars from going there, but what about all these other dollars that possibly might go there? So that's why I ask. And
we have to run, but I just have a quick follow-up also, which is what do the documents tell us about the chain of command in terms of whether Dr. Fauci or, who would have had to sign off on this and who has said that they didn't sign off on gain of function?
Well, it's clear that program officers at NIH reviewed the documents and would have had to review them in order for the grant to continue. That much is clear. Fauci's name, for example, does not appear in the documents. But he was called to testify about grants like this and about this sort of work in Wuhan, and the implication was that he was testifying about this particular project. And in terms of gain of function research in general, there was considerable debate in the scientific community before the pandemic that really did not fall across partisan lines at all over whether this sort of research should be allowed. And, many virologists just were on one side and felt it was valuable. Many were on the other. And that's part of the reason this discussion has been so contentious. And that there has also been a little bit of debate over what the definition is. And so we were very careful to ask people, ask a broad spectrum of researchers what they thought. And the vast majority said they felt it was gain of function.
And we should just add one quick thing, a note, which is that gain of function, and we do this in the piece, we say it's very specifically a subset of gain of function, which is gain of function research on these potential pandemic pathogens. There's all sorts of gain of function research that people agree is fine and useful. So just to make that point.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good point. When it could lead to a pandemic, that's when the public gets it's a little bit concerned with it. Otherwise, it's like, hey, go for it. But Sharon and Mara, terrific reporting. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And we'll have more Rising for you right after this.